May I come in?
If you bend your medial and collateral ligaments, place one talus in front of another, I don't see where you'd have a problem. Of course, if there were a news story covering this event, the headline might read, "Small brain enters room."
Fingers. What's the answer?
Oh, you're another one of those bright young fellows who always know the right answer, huh? Welcome to real life. How many do you see?
There are 4 fingers, Arthur.
No. Look at me. You're focusing on the problem. If you focus on the problem, you can't see the solution. Never focus on the problem. Look at me. How many do you see? Look beyond the fingers. How many do you see? 8. 8. 8. Yes. 8's a good answer. See what no one else sees. See what everyone else chooses not to see. Out of fear, conformity, and laziness. See the whole world anew each day. Well, the truth is, you're well on the way. You didn't see something here besides a crazy, bitter old man. You wouldn't have come in the first place.
Some people see more, some people understand more about life than others because they've lived more of life than others. They've lived it in such a way that they glean things from life that the rest of us just miss. You can see it in their face, you can read it in their eyes. They just know more, and you cannot wait to explore it with them. They've seen life and death. They've seen spring and harvest, violence and healing, demolition and construction. They've wept with grief and with wonder. They have laughed at others and laughed at themselves. They have mourned in the evening. They have danced at sunrise. They've skipped stones across a pond, and they've stacked them as a memorial. They've held others to their chest and kept others at arm's length. They sought things when lost and did their best to lose things they didn't want to find or didn't want to remember. They've kept keepsakes and tossed out what others might have kept. They've torn a favorite shirt, spent time mending it. They've known what it is to hold their tongue and when to speak their mind. They've loved passionately. They've seethed with hate. They've battled against someone or something, and they've turned peacemaker. No wonder such people make it to the big screen. Their lives are big enough to tell on the big screen. We know them. Patch Adams, Lincoln, Elizabeth, Aaron Brockovich, Martin Luther King Jr., Gandhi, Philomena, Billie Holiday, Forrest Gump. They make it to the big screen because we understand that somehow in telling their story, we're actually telling a bigger story. It's not just about them. That's what makes it so appealing. Their lives open up a window into history or into human life itself, the events of their lives. Through them, we begin to see the bigger story of the times in which they lived, or what it means to be a human being at a certain time. What gives their story its real impact is how they lived in those times, how they lived through those times. And we flock to those kinds of films because we understand that if we can learn from them the secret of living in and through their kind of times, maybe we would understand something of how to live in and through our own times. So if given the chance to ask them about life, to ask them what they've learned from life, what they've seen in life, we lean forward, even in a movie theater, lean forward, stop munching on the popcorn long enough to listen to what they might have to say. And I thought about how we would tell today's story, and I imagined being in a theater where there would be simply this view of a person's face, a close-up on that face, and the camera would zoom in on that face, and you would hear a questioner speaking. It's not the person who's being zoomed in on, but it's another voice in the room. What do you remember? What do you think about when you think back over your life? What did it mean to you? What have you learned? What are the things that stand out all of these years after? And the person's eyes become focused as if they're looking out into the distance, and it's like they're seeing images begin to form, or they're hearing voices that begin to speak to them. And you can tell from the look on their face that they are being transported to where it all began, to where something about the story picked up, and they began to understand their own story through those kinds of events. And then the picture on the screen sweeps us back with them into that place and time. Meaningless, meaningless, it's all meaningless and useless. Did I scare you? Because that's how I picture this story being told. Asking some wizened old people, what's the secret to life? And watching them blurt out like a crotchety old man, it's all meaningless and useless. But the filmmaker would zero in on that face, because then you could see the twinkle in the eye. Then you would understand that it's just the first thing that this person has to say, but it's not the last. And whatever he's about to say won't be meaningless. If the name doesn't ring a bell, it's because the Bible character Koheleth goes in the Bible by a number of other names. Koheleth is a Hebrew word that means a gatherer. It's one who gathers a crowd together, gathers things together, but it's primarily a person who clusters people. We might translate it as the teacher or the preacher. It's the person who calls folks together. They gather them together. The Greek version of Koheleth is the version that we know best, Ecclesiastes. That's his name, Ecclesiastes, or it's his title, really. It's not his actual name. Chapter 3 from the book that is credited to him is what we all sang together for a few minutes. Just a little music trivia. Pete Seeger wrote that song actually back in the 1950s. He put the music to the text of the King James Bible and only added 6 of his own words to the text. And the rest came exactly straight out of the King James Version of the Bible. The more familiar version of the song, however, came from a group called the Byrds, which is no relation to Byrd LaCroix's family, but maybe a distant cousin. I don't know. It climbed to number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 chart in December of 1965. If the name Ecclesiastes still doesn't ring a bell for you, you would probably be more familiar with his common name, Solomon, as in King Solomon, as in the son of David, the great king and monarch of Israel, who led Israel into the beginning of the golden age, and his son Solomon picked it up from there. And by the way, since the words turn, turn, turn are attributed to King Solomon, somewhere around 900 BC, quite a number of years ago, 3 millennia or so ago, it means that it's the only number 1 top hit to have the oldest lyrics. It's just one more achievement by a remarkable man. And it's just dust in the wind, Koheleth would say. Sorry. Because he knows that every song that makes it to the top eventually falls down from the top and falls off the Hot 100 and cools off. He's seen it all. He seems to prefer Koheleth to his given name because it best describes how he lived. He was a gatherer. He spent his life gathering wisdom and knowledge and experiences and people. He gathered his thoughts into a series of writings that stood the test of time. You'll find them somewhere around the middle of your Bibles. The Song of Songs came first. It was a racy love poem crafted in his younger years. Despite what some people will tell you, this is not about loving Jesus. This is about some hot love between a guy and a gal. A few years later, he put together a collection of how-to thoughts on business and finance and relationships and success, and he titled it simply Proverbs. And then when he was late in his life and he had worn the seat of his throne threadbare, he penned Ecclesiastes. He would call it his favorite collection, a kind of memoir in which he gathered together all of his thoughts in a frank and brutally blunt commentary about where you find meaning in life. And aside from the number one status of his poem from chapter 3, the book, his third book, never made it to the top of the Jerusalem Times bestseller list. Critics panned it as dark and dismal, depressing, the words of a cynic and a skeptic. They liked his wife's book about their dog better, and it was the one that became the bestseller. But his story somehow endured, gathered by someone who saw beneath the crusty monarch's words something worth keeping. So that gatherer himself placed it on a shelf somewhere close to the two popular reads by Solomon, nestled in between Isaiah and the Psalms, perhaps hoping that a bit of that flavor of those two books would wear off on it. The reason we're drawn to his story is because Koheleth has no interest in giving us advice or telling us what to do and how to live. This is not 7 Habits of Highly Successful People. This is not and how to stop doubting your greatness and start living an awesome life. I'll let you Google that title in and of itself. This is not how to be the best, fill in the blank. Instead, he simply tells the story of his life, and he leaves it for us to decide if his discoveries have any value to us. In that sense, it's a book of great faith and a book of great humility. And it's as far from the beginning of his life as you could imagine. Born into privilege, Solomon was the second child of his father David and his mother Bathsheba. She had been another man's wife when his father seduced her and got her pregnant. And then he had her husband killed in an accident back at the war front. David acted the magnanimous hero by taking the widow in. His sin was discovered, and their child died shortly after childbirth. Solomon was their second child. His name means peace, and it may reflect how David had found a way to make peace with God, maybe even with himself, over all that had happened. Solomon had a unique combination of ability, ambition, and advantage, and his book notes that he not only had it all, he tried it all. Trying to find the path to meaning, he walked 4 different forks in the road. One we might call the path of knowledge. He'd read it all and knew it all, and he found that the more he learned, it only left him with more questions and more to learn. How many pages can you Google today? Because tomorrow you'll be able to Google another 1,000,000. He tried the path of affluence. Israel was on the trade route to the sea, and Solomon implemented a series of trade tariffs and regional taxes, and it made him really wealthy. Estimates place his worth in today's currency at $2.1 trillion, which would make him the wealthiest person of all history. And yet he discovered that having everything still wasn't enough. The problem with having more is that you still want more. It's like drinking salt water. And the worry is that when you die, you'll end up leaving it to people who will blow it. He tried the path of pleasure. Having it all gave him the freedom to try it all. But he found that newness wears off quickly, and he needed something else to give him a thrill or a new high, even with 1,000 wives and concubines. In the end, he would long for the love of one single person, who he could love and who would love him. And he tried the path of achievements. He was the Renaissance man of his day. Politically astute, he formed alliances, he brokered peace. He appears to have been an economic genius who somehow led Israel, this little fledgling nation state nobody paid attention to, in one of the leading global influences of their day. And it was their age of prosperity. His work as an architect and designer became the pride of Israel. He built the first temple in Jerusalem, a grand structure, an architectural wonder that took 7 years to build. And then he took 13 years to build his own house. Lavish and luxurious beyond what anyone had ever seen or heard of. 7 years and 13 years. Some of you have had a contractor like that. And yet with all of his achievements, all of those big, great rooms, the larger they were, the more empty it felt. And he says that with all of this, he had become the ultimate gatherer. And what he found was that one can never gather enough. It is like scooping water with a colander. It is like holding it in your hands. It is the sobering words of a man who discovered that having everything you ever wanted is never enough. Those are sobering words for any time in culture. Aren't you happy you came to church? It gets better. But they're particularly sobering for our time and for our culture. Pleasure, knowledge, achievement, affluence. Those are the seductive temptresses of every time and age. They lead us away from finding meaning in our lives because they lead us to believe that meaning and purpose comes from something we do or something we acquire. It comes from something that proves we're self-made. Meaning, Koheleth discovered, cannot come from outside of yourself. It must come from within you. Life is not what we make of ourselves. Real life comes from what we've been given. Love, relationships, opportunities, time itself. Time itself is the beautiful thing that comes to us in every season because of what is being given to us. And the meaning of what is given comes when we look beyond the hand and see the face of the one who gave it. That understanding, Koheleth says, is the only thing he's chosen to keep out of everything he's gathered. The rest of it, he says, I have learned to cast it away. His answer is more than religious. It is the most deeply spiritual discovery that you will find of an individual in Scripture. There is a part of us that can never be at peace until we have come to see that we are creatures of an amazing God who loves us and has placed something of his own divine nature and personality deep within us. And the longing for eternity that we find in our hearts, that Ecclesiastes cites in chapter 3, cannot be met in temporal things. We were meant for so much more because we are created in a greater image than any of us can imagine. Would he change anything if he could? Maybe, but he knows he can't. Regret simply eats up the clock that is already running. What keeps him now What he keeps now, rather, is what governs his every waking minute. And while it may be near sunset for him, he lives life with two simple principles. It's not his advice to you or to me. He just simply says, this is what I've discovered. Take it for what it's worth. The first is the understanding that crisis creates choices. Forces them, really. All of life is a choice, a series of decisions. What time will you get up? What will you wear? What will you eat? What will you do first? What will you say? Where will you spend time? Who will you spend it with? When will you call it quits? When will you go to bed? Like his poem observed, it's always one time or another. And we must choose what to do with that time while it is happening. That's what makes it hard. The challenge is time is always going somewhere, but too often we don't want to go with it. We keep looking back to the past, wishing something hadn't changed. Oh, if only I could. You hear that? If I could turn back the clock, if I could try. It's longing for a time that's already passed, Koheleth says. You can't recover it. Or we keep looking toward the future, spending the current moments just getting ready for what we think is coming or what we hope will come. And Koheleth says that he discovered that regret and anticipation were causing him to miss the very moment he was in. It's like watching the pendulum on a clock. His eye kept focusing on the extremes of where it was going. And all the while there was this great space that the pendulum was just swinging through. And he never learned, he said, as a young person, how to stand in it. And that's when he began to look for the beauty in the moment he was in. So I concluded that there is nothing better for people than to be happy and to enjoy themselves as long as they can. And people should eat and drink and enjoy the fruits of their labor, for these are gifts from God. We think the time is always running out. But Koheleth looked and he saw that there was time for everything under the sun. Life to death, planting to harvesting, silence to laughter, grief to joy. We don't need to beat the clock or outsmart time or manage time. We simply need to receive it. I've not always been a basketball fan, but this past season I became one. I got a case of March Madness really bad. And I was really on the edge of my seat during all those close games when it seemed the final shot was going to determine whether someone went to the next round or not. I didn't have a dog in that hunt. I wasn't betting on anything. And if I'd have won, I wouldn't have tithed. Sorry. But I didn't bet on anything. But what really fascinated me was that in the last minute or 90 seconds of the game, coaches called timeout and turned seconds into minutes, almost into hours. Did you notice that? Koheleth said, if I had my druthers, I'd like to have an NCAA coach run the final minutes of my clock. Because, man, he could stretch it out and I'd never die. To be so focused on the moment, though, with who I am with and what I am doing seems to be the fuller, more purposeful, more meaningful, instead of always sitting in the moment and thinking, what just happened, and looking forward to what's next. Koheleth says, I learned to just sit and receive what was happening in the now. He said, and it's changed my life. Perhaps we would do well to learn to tell time the way Koheleth did. In the West, our day begins and it ends at midnight, which means that we begin and end each day in the dark. Do you ever think about that? Which makes us feel like by the time we've already gotten up, we've already lost a good portion of the day, and when we go to bed, we're losing the last half of the day. But Koheleth's culture learned to tell time differently. And there was evening, and there was morning the first day. Hebrew time runs by the Sabbath, by the clock rather starting at sundown, which means that the last hours of every single day in every season of the year always ends in the light. And the first moments and hours of every day of the year and every season of your life begins in the light. Koheleth said he learned the wisdom of structuring time by his faith. Remember to linger in the light, both at the beginning and the end of your day. And you'll see the beauty of the time you're in. Second, Koheleth discovered his faith, rediscovered it. He learned to trust something other than himself and to appreciate things beyond the work of his own hands. God has made everything beautiful for its own time. He has planted eternity in the human heart. But even so, people cannot see the whole scope of God's work from beginning to end. Well, what's that mean? As the motion of time points out, we live in a world of beginnings and endings. There's always a time for this and a time for that, and it's always in flux. God has planted eternity in the human heart. We sense that there's more to come. We sense that it came from somewhere before us. But we can't grasp where those 2 points are. How many of you actually remember the day you were born? No? How many of you have already scheduled the day you're going to die? No? Even with your day timers? We cannot see the full beginning of something we know is starting, the beginning of college, the beginning of marriage, the first day of a new job, the birth of a child. We know all things are coming, but we're only at the beginning, and we can't imagine what the rest of that beginning will be. And we can't see in the full beginning of something that is starting, the end of it. How college will turn out, whether we'll change our major, whether we'll drop out, whether we'll go on to grad school, whether we'll fall in love, and who will it be with, and where will we work and live, and how will our kids look and turn out, and where will we be when the end of our life comes. We have this sense that that's how life works. It's this long, grand thing, but you cannot see the points. It curves around the earth. You just can't peer around the curve. I have observed something else in the world of ours. The fastest runner doesn't always win the race, and the strongest warrior doesn't always win the battle. The wise are often poor, and the skillful are not necessarily wealthy. And those who are educated don't always lead successful lives. Not only can I not see the beginning and the end of things, but for the life of me, I can't understand half of what I do see. It just baffles me. Even with all he knew and experienced, Koheleth admitted he couldn't see it all, couldn't understand it all, and therefore his life required him to live by faith, to trust something or someone who he himself could not see, but could sense there was something else guiding all of those seasons, all of the swings of life. The end of the matter, all has been heard, he says. Fear God, keep his commandments, for that is the whole duty of everyone. It's where he brings his search to a conclusion. He's found that indeed life under the sun has no meaning, which is why you must tie your life to something beyond the sun. to someone above the sun. And like Forrest Gump, Koheleth simply says, that's all I've got to say about that. Well, it's not quite. He does say one more thing. A wise teacher's words spur students to action and emphasize important truths. The collected sayings of the wise are like guidance from a shepherd. Take it for what it's worth, Koheleth says. He discovered his sense of worth isn't determined by whether or not people agree or disagree with him, whether we'll hold his words and take the time to keep them, or whether we will cast them away. But if we choose to keep them, we choose to allow them to shape our choices, then we may discover the truth of Jesus' own words. You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free.